The words sliced through the air like a blade, sharp and unexpected, cutting through the polished silence of the executive boardroom at Meridian Aerospace. David Weber froze behind his cleaning cart, his grip on the mop handle tightening until his knuckles turned white. Through the glass partition, he could see her clearly. Emma Richardson, Director of European Operations for Meridian Aerospace, dressed in an immaculate charcoal blazer and cream silk blouse, holding a thick document bundle like it was some kind of amusing prop in an elaborate joke. She waved the papers with a smirk that could have powered half the building's lighting system, her voice carrying that particular brand of corporate arrogance that David had learned to recognize from his years of invisible servitude in these gleaming halls. Seriously, people, even our top legal consultants threw in the towel on this one, she announced to the room full of executives, each one more expensively dressed than the last. It's all in some archaic mix of German aerospace terminology and Italian contract law. Technical aviation meets European bureaucracy at its absolute worst. I'm telling you right now, translate this monster, and I'll personally write you a check for my entire quarterly salary. The burst of laughter that erupted from the 5 men seated around the imported Italian marble conference table was the kind that only comes from people who have never worried about money, never wondered if they could afford groceries, never counted pennies to pay rent. Crystal glasses clinked together in a toast to impossibility, and someone whistled low before saying, "Emma, that's 600,000 you're talking about. You absolutely certain you want to lose that kind of money over what amounts to a party trick?" She tilted her perfectly coiffed head with the confidence of someone who had never been wrong about anything in her entire privileged life, her smile growing even wider as she surveyed the room like a queen addressing her court. "I'm not even remotely worried about it. There isn't a single person in this entire building, hell, probably not in this entire city, who could possibly make sense of this legal nightmare. It's like someone took the most complex aerospace engineering manual ever written, translated it into German, then had it rewritten by Italian lawyers who apparently learned their trade from medieval monks." David continued his methodical cleaning, his mop gliding silently across the spotless hardwood floors that he had polished to perfection countless times before. He didn't need to see the document to know exactly what kind of linguistic labyrinth it contained. The intricate structure of technical German aerospace terminology was burned into his memory like the lyrics of a song he had once loved but now tried desperately not to sing. The cadence of Italian legal language was as familiar to him as his own heartbeat, each clause and subcondition a reminder of the life he had abandoned, the expertise he had buried beneath years of deliberate invisibility. "Make absolutely sure the cleaning crew doesn't accidentally dispose of this little treasure," Emma added with a theatrical wink, tossing the document onto the mahogany side table near the elaborate coffee station with its imported espresso machine and crystal water glasses. "Who knows? Maybe someday it'll be worth something to somebody with actual linguistic skills instead of the pretenders we keep hiring." David forced himself not to react, not to let even the slightest flicker of recognition cross his features. He had spent the better part of a decade perfecting the art of invisibility, of becoming so thoroughly unremarkable that powerful people could speak freely in front of him as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture with the ability to hold a mop. But his hand gripping the cleaning tool had gone completely white with the effort of maintaining his carefully constructed facade. He pushed his cart past the edge of the conference room and rounded the corner into the corridor, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had mapped every inch of these halls during countless midnight shifts. Only when the heavy oak door closed behind him, effectively muffling the continued laughter and congratulatory chatter from within, did he allow himself to stop moving. His breath came slowly and evenly, a meditation technique he had learned during those dark months after everything fell apart, when breathing itself had seemed like an insurmountable challenge. He reached into his back pocket for the worn cloth he always carried, wiping his hands with movements that had become almost ritualistic over the years. Then, with one quick glance up and down the corridor to ensure he was completely alone, he turned back toward the conference room, walked quietly on feet that had learned to make no sound whatsoever, and picked up the document that would change everything. Down in the basement-level janitor's break room, surrounded by the mechanical hum of industrial washing machines and the harsh glare of fluorescent lights that never seemed to provide quite enough illumination, David sat alone on the cracked vinyl bench that had seen better decades. The document lay open across his lap like a map to a treasure he wasn't sure he wanted to find. His eyes, trained by years of academic rigor that seemed like a lifetime ago, scanned each page with the precision of a surgeon examining X-rays. The handwritten margin notes were in 3 different languages. The diagrams showed aerospace component specifications that would make most engineers weep with confusion, and the dense legal references seemed designed specifically to trap the unwary in a web of European regulatory nightmares. It was worse than Emma had suggested, far more complex and infinitely more dangerous than anyone in that boardroom could possibly have imagined. A clause buried deep in Section 7 would have granted their Italian partners unrestricted access to classified propulsion technology that had taken Meridian 15 years and $2 billion to develop. Another section, written in language so deliberately opaque that it might as well have been encrypted, effectively surrendered the intellectual property rights to any collaborative aerospace innovations developed over the next decade. The implications were staggering, the potential for industrial espionage breathtaking in its scope. David exhaled slowly through his nose, his breath creating a small cloud in the perpetually chilly basement air. "They didn't read this," he muttered to the empty room, his voice echoing off concrete walls that had absorbed decades of whispered conversations and private frustrations. They couldn't possibly have read this and still been laughing. He ran a callous thumb over the Meridian Aerospace logo embossed in the corner of each page, the corporate symbol that had become as familiar to him as his own reflection. It had been 12 long years since he had last translated a document of this complexity, 12 years since he had walked away from the lecture halls and research laboratories, since he had voluntarily erased his name from academic journals and conference proceedings to become a ghost in a navy blue uniform. 12 years since Dr. David Weber, renowned professor of applied linguistics and international contract law, had simply vanished from the academic world as completely as if he had never existed at all. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside the break room, the sharp click of expensive heels on polished concrete that could only belong to someone who didn't belong in the basement levels where the real work happened. David quickly folded the contract with practiced efficiency, slipped it into his worn canvas backpack alongside his thermos of cold coffee and the paperback novel he never seemed to have time to finish, and stood up with the fluid motion of someone who had learned to disappear at a moment's notice. He still had 3 more floors to clean before his shift ended, 3 more floors of gleaming surfaces and empty offices filled with the detritus of corporate ambition. 3 more floors of invisible labor that kept the machinery of commerce running smoothly, while the people who mattered slept peacefully in their suburban mansions, never giving a moment's thought to the army of shadows who maintained their perfect world. It was 3:47 in the morning when David finally stepped into his modest apartment, a cramped but clean space that he had managed to make feel like home despite its obvious limitations. His daughter Sarah was asleep on the convertible sofa that served as both living room seating and her bedroom, one arm dangling off the edge with the unconscious grace that only children possess, her sketchbook open beside her to a half-finished drawing of what appeared to be a mechanical bird with impossibly intricate wings. David paused in the doorway, studying her peaceful face in the dim glow filtering in from the kitchen. At 15, she was beginning to show the intellectual curiosity that had once driven his own academic pursuits, asking questions about language and meaning that reminded him daily of everything he had given up and everything he had gained in return. She had her mother's artistic sensibility and her father's analytical mind, a combination that promised either great success or great frustration, depending on how the world chose to receive her gifts. In the kitchen, David brewed his nightly cup of coffee using the ancient coffee maker that had somehow survived 3 apartment moves and countless late-night study sessions, then sat at the scarred wooden table that had once belonged to his grandmother. He pulled out his old laptop, a machine that had seen better years but still functioned well enough for his purposes, and waited for the familiar startup chime that always sounded like a memory calling from across an impossible distance. From a drawer that stuck and required just the right combination of lifting and pulling, he retrieved a cracked leather journal, his old reference book filled with notes he had taken on dialectical variations, aerospace terminology, and European legal frameworks. The pages were covered with annotations in 3 languages, margin notes that traced the evolution of technical vocabulary across cultures and centuries, linguistic archaeologies that most people would find incomprehensibly boring, but that had once represented the cutting edge of his professional expertise. And then, quietly and methodically, with the city sleeping outside his window and only the distant hum of traffic to keep him company, David began to translate. Word by word, clause by clause, he began to unravel the linguistic maze that had been designed to confuse and mislead, to hide dangerous commitments behind layers of technical jargon and legal misdirection. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the muscle memory of someone who had once written extensively about the very problems he was now solving, each keystroke a small act of rebellion against the invisibility he had embraced. The next morning dawned gray and unremarkable, the kind of day that seemed designed for people to go about their business without paying attention to anything beyond their immediate concerns. Meridian Aerospace gleamed in the pale sunlight like a monument to human ambition, every glass surface polished to perfection, every corridor silent in its early-hour tranquility that would soon be shattered by the arrival of hundreds of employees, each focused on their small piece of the vast corporate puzzle. David placed a sealed envelope into the company's internal document submission slot, the one labeled Legal Department, Confidential Review, in gold lettering that matched the executive elevator buttons. There was no signature on the envelope, no return address, no indication of where the contents had originated. Just a clean, typed translation accompanied by a 3-page analysis of the legal implications, written in the precise, academic style that he had once used to publish papers that were read by perhaps a dozen people worldwide, but that had nevertheless advanced human understanding in small but meaningful ways. As he walked past the reception desk with its marble countertops and fresh flower arrangements that were replaced twice weekly, Emma Richardson stepped out of the executive elevator flanked by 2 legal advisors whose expressions suggested they had been delivering bad news. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished floor with the authoritative rhythm of someone who had never doubted her place in the world, her eyes sweeping the lobby with the casual surveillance of a predator checking for threats or opportunities. Her gaze landed on David for perhaps half a second, just long enough for the slightest flicker of recognition to cross her features before being replaced by the dismissive indifference that important people reserve for those they consider beneath notice. He was background noise to her, a fixture in the corporate landscape no more worthy of attention than the potted plants or security cameras, and that was exactly how he preferred it. David dipped his head respectfully, a gesture so subtle it might have been imagined, and continued on his way toward the service elevator that would take him to the lower levels where his official duties awaited. She didn't acknowledge him in any way, which was perfectly fine with him. He wasn't seeking recognition or gratitude. He was seeking something far more valuable and infinitely more elusive, the quiet satisfaction of having done the right thing for its own sake, regardless of whether anyone would ever know or care. That evening, as David walked with Sarah through the tree-lined streets near their apartment building, she skipped beside him with the unconscious energy of someone who hadn't yet learned to be tired by the weight of adult responsibilities. Her backpack bounced against her shoulder with each step, filled with textbooks and art supplies and the accumulated treasures that teenagers collect like evidence of their existence in the world. "Dad?" she asked suddenly, her voice carrying that particular tone that suggested she had been thinking about something for a while before working up the courage to voice it. "Do you ever miss being a professor?" The question hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. David smiled, the expression reaching his eyes in a way that had become more common over the past few years as the acute pain of his losses had gradually transformed into something more manageable, more like a scar than an open wound. "I was never just a professor, sweetheart. I was your mother's husband first, and now I'm your father. Everything else was just job titles and academic politics." Sarah wrinkled her nose in the way she had been doing since she was small, a gesture that invariably preceded her most perceptive observations. "But you're really, really smart. Like, scary smart. Don't you think it's kind of a waste to spend your time cleaning offices when you could be teaching people important things?" He chuckled, a sound that carried more warmth than humor. Being smart doesn't automatically mean you have to stand in front of a classroom or publish papers that 3 people will read. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is know when to speak and when to listen, when to step forward and when to step back. Sometimes wisdom looks like choosing the life that allows you to be present for the people who matter most. She tilted her head thoughtfully, studying him with the intensity that reminded him so powerfully of her mother it sometimes took his breath away. Is that one of your old professor's sayings, or did you learn that from being a janitor? David stopped walking and looked at her seriously, seeing not just his daughter, but the young woman she was becoming, someone who would soon have to navigate the complex world of adult choices and compromises. That's something I learned from being your dad, he said quietly, and it's the most important lesson I've ever figured out. For the first time in years, he meant it completely. The bus wheezed to a stop in front of Sarah's school with the mechanical sigh of urban transportation that has seen too many miles and carried too many dreams. David stepped down into the crisp morning air, clutching the brown paper bag that contained her lunch and a small surprise he had managed to afford after weeks of careful budgeting. A set of professional-grade colored pencils that she had been admiring through the art store window, with the longing that only comes from truly understanding the difference between wanting something and needing it. He adjusted the collar of his jacket against the morning chill, listening to the city wake up around him with the familiar symphony of car horns, rolling tires against wet pavement, and voices rising and falling in the eternal urban conversation that never quite stops. It all sounded distant to David, as if he were hearing it through water or thick glass, because his mind was still processing the implications of the document he had spent the night translating, the clauses that kept replaying in his consciousness like warning bells that wouldn't stop ringing. Inside the school's bustling hallway, teenagers moved with the chaotic energy of people who haven't yet learned to conserve their enthusiasm for special occasions. Sarah stood at her locker, pushing a strand of dark hair behind her ear in a gesture she had inherited from her mother, surrounded by a cluster of classmates who were engaged in the kind of animated conversation that only seems possible before the day's responsibilities settle in like fog. David slowed his pace, catching sight of her face just as one of the boys in the group laughed with the cruel edge that teenagers sometimes develop when they're trying to establish their place in the social hierarchy. "That's Sarah," the boy said, his voice carrying just a little too loudly. "Her dad's the night janitor at Meridian Aerospace. Basically cleans toilets with a PhD." The ripple of snickering that followed was the sound of casual cruelty, the kind that cuts deeper because it's delivered without malice, just thoughtless entertainment at someone else's expense. David's hand tightened around the paper bag until he could feel the pencils shifting inside, but he forced himself to remain still, to let Sarah handle this moment in whatever way felt right to her. She had been dealing with variations of this conversation for years, ever since his career change had become public knowledge in their small community, and he had learned to trust her judgment about when she needed his intervention and when she needed to fight her own battles. Sarah's eyes darted toward him briefly, just long enough for him to see that she wasn't hurt or surprised, just tired. Then she turned back to the boy with the kind of calm dignity that would have made her mother proud, and said clearly, "My dad speaks 5 languages fluently and used to publish research that contributed to international aerospace safety standards. How many lives has your father's work saved lately?" The silence that followed was the sound of a 15-year-old girl refusing to be diminished by ignorance. The boy blinked, clearly not having expected to encounter actual resistance to his casual mockery. The other students shuffled their feet and found sudden interest in their phones, the way people do when they realize they've been witnesses to something more serious than they bargained for. A teacher's voice calling students to class provided the perfect excuse for everyone to scatter, leaving Sarah alone at her locker with her dignity intact and her head held high. David approached her slowly, crouching down so they were at eye level despite the fact that she was nearly as tall as he was now. "I brought your lunch," he said gently, placing the bag in her hands with the care of someone offering a gift rather than fulfilling an obligation. "And something extra." Sarah opened the top of the bag, and when she saw the professional pencils nestled inside, her eyes widened with the kind of genuine joy that reminded David why every sacrifice had been worth making. "You remembered," she whispered, as if she had been afraid to hope for something she wanted so much. "Of course I remembered," David smiled, standing up and straightening her backpack strap with the automatic gesture of a parent who notices small discomforts. "You're my favorite artist in the entire world." She looked down at the pencils, then back up at him with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and curiosity. Why didn't you tell them what you used to do? About your research, your publications, your awards? David considered the question carefully, knowing that his answer would become part of how she understood the world and her place in it. Because it's not about what I used to do, Sarah. It's about who I still am, and who I'm choosing to be right now. Today, I'm the guy who's probably going to be late for his maintenance rounds if he doesn't get moving. He straightened up with a smile that carried no trace of regret or bitterness. And I'm the dad who loves you more than any job title could ever matter. Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her face in the way that reminded David of every sunset he had ever stopped to appreciate. Thanks, Dad, for the pencils and for, everything else. Later that evening, after the city had settled into its evening rhythm and the office buildings had emptied of their daytime occupants, David stood behind the stove in their small kitchen, stirring a pot of lentil soup that filled the apartment with the warming scents of cumin and garlic. The sound of Sarah's pencil scratching against paper provided a gentle soundtrack to his thoughts, a reminder that creativity and hope could flourish even in the smallest spaces if they were tended with enough care. He leaned against the counter, letting the familiar ritual of cooking settle his mind while he thought about his late wife, Maria, and the way she used to hum unconsciously while preparing meals, transforming the simple act of nourishment into something approaching art. She had been the dreamer in their partnership, the one who saw possibilities where he saw problems, who believed in the power of beauty to change the world in ways that logic and analysis never could. When she passed away 13 years ago, something fundamental in David had broken, not with the explosive violence of an accident, but with the quiet finality of a door closing forever. Like a story that would never reach its proper conclusion, leaving all the main characters suspended in permanent incompleteness. He had walked away from his academic career, from his research, from the professional recognition that had taken him decades to build, not because he no longer valued those things, but because they had suddenly seemed impossibly distant from anything that mattered. His colleagues had called him Dr. Weber, had cited his papers in their own research, had invited him to conferences where his opinions carried weight and influence. Now, the people who knew him at all simply called him David, if they bothered to learn his name in the first place. But he had never truly regretted the choice. Not when he tucked Sarah in each night, not when she shared her artwork with him, not when they spent quiet evenings like this one building a life that was small but complete. Still, tonight, after translating that document and remembering what it felt like to exercise intellectual muscles that had been dormant for over a decade, the weight of his decision pressed against him with unusual intensity. That line Emma had delivered with such casual arrogance, "Translate this, and my salary is yours," echoed in his mind not because of the money involved, but because of what it represented. The assumption that expertise was so rare, so valuable, that it could be treated as a kind of parlor trick, a source of entertainment for people who had never had to sacrifice anything meaningful to acquire knowledge. He served the soup into two mismatched bowls, then sat across from Sarah at the table that had become the center of their domestic universe. She dipped her spoon thoughtfully, then looked up at him with the directness that had always been one of her most distinctive characteristics. "You okay, Dad? You've got that look." David chuckled softly, marveling at how well she could read his moods after all these years of just the two of them navigating the world together. "You've been watching me since you were 3 years old. Of course you know when something's on my mind." "I heard Ms. Patterson talking on the phone earlier," she admitted, her voice carrying the slight guilt of someone confessing to accidental eavesdropping. "Something about a contract issue at your work." She sounded worried. He paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth, considering how much truth a 15-year-old should have to carry. "It's complicated, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes with important documents, and it takes other grown-ups to figure out how to fix them." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, swirling her soup in patterns that reminded him of the abstract designs she had been favoring in her recent artwork. "You don't have to tell me the details, but if it's the kind of complicated that means you get to help people, then I'm glad it happened." David studied her across the table, this young woman who had inherited her mother's artistic vision and her father's analytical mind, who somehow managed to see past surface appearances to the essential truths that adults often missed. "Have I ever told you why I really stopped teaching?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. She shook her head, setting down her spoon with the careful attention of someone who recognizes an important moment when it arrives. Not really. I always figured it was because of Mom, but you never wanted to talk about it. David stirred his soup slowly, buying time while he searched for words that would be honest without being overwhelming. It wasn't because I stopped loving the work. I loved everything about it. The research, the languages, the students who were genuinely excited to learn about how communication works across cultures. The problem was that when your mom got sick, I realized something that changed everything for me. What was that? Sarah asked, her voice soft with the kind of careful attention that suggested she understood they were approaching something important. I realized that being the smartest person in the room, having my name on important papers, getting invited to conferences where people hung on my every word, none of that meant anything if the people I loved most in the world were suffering and I wasn't there to help them through it. So I chose to be there, to be present for what mattered most, even if it meant giving up everything else. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the seriousness it deserved. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than sad. Do you miss it? The teaching, the research, having people know how smart you are. David continued stirring his soup, watching the steam rise and dissipate in the warm kitchen air. Some days I missed the intellectual challenge, the satisfaction of solving complex problems that most people would find impossible. But you know what I've learned, Sarah? You're worth every word I never got to publish, every lecture I never got to give, every moment of recognition I never received. You're worth all of it and more. Later that night, after Sarah had fallen asleep and the apartment had settled into the deep quiet that only comes in the small hours, David sat at the kitchen table with the completed translation sealed in a manila envelope, ready to be delivered to Meridian's legal department through their anonymous submission system. He reached for a different journal, not the one filled with linguistic notes and technical references, but a personal one he had started keeping after Maria's death, a place where he recorded thoughts that were too private for academic publication but too important to forget. He flipped to a blank page and wrote in the careful handwriting that had served him through decades of research and note-taking. Translated the aerospace contract today. 43 pages, 35,000 words. Multiple clauses that could have compromised national security and cost the company billions in penalties and lawsuits. They laughed when they made their challenge, assumed that expertise was so rare it might as well be magical. Tomorrow I'll return to being invisible, to cleaning their offices while they congratulate themselves on their cleverness. But tonight, I remembered what it feels like to be exactly who I was trained to be. And for the first time in years, I don't feel small. He closed the journal and turned off the kitchen light. But before he made his way to his bedroom, he looked once more at the envelope on the counter, then whispered to the darkness with a smile that no one would ever see. Let's see if they're still laughing when they realize what they almost signed. At 6:17 in the morning, the city was still wrapped in the gray light that comes just before dawn, when the darkness hasn't quite decided to surrender to the day, but the sun hasn't yet claimed victory over the night. David stood beneath the soaring glass atrium of Meridian Aerospace, envelope in hand, feeling like an actor who had wandered onto the wrong stage, but somehow knew all the lines anyway. The marble floor beneath his work boots was spotless, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the architectural lighting with the kind of perfection that only comes from hours of careful, invisible labor. He had cleaned these floors himself hundreds of times over the years, working through the night while the city slept and the important people dreamed of deals and mergers and quarterly profits that existed in a realm far removed from mops and industrial cleaning solutions. He hesitated at the internal document drop labeled Legal Department, Confidential Submissions, feeling the weight of the envelope in his hands as if it contained something far more substantial than paper and ink. Then, with a motion that felt both inevitable and revolutionary, he slid the envelope through the slot, listening to it land with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the empty atrium like a gunshot. No signature, no identification, no way to trace the submission back to its source. Just his words, his analysis, and the truth that someone with power would soon have to confront whether they wanted to or not. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath create a small cloud in the cool morning air, then whispered to the empty lobby, "Back to work." Upstairs on the 42nd floor, the executive offices buzzed with the kind of controlled tension that comes when important people realize they may have made a very expensive mistake. Emma Richardson stepped into her private office at 7:23 a.m., black coffee in a porcelain cup, tablet computer in her manicured hand, heels clicking against the hardwood floor with the sharp rhythm of someone who had built a career on never showing weakness or uncertainty. The document was already waiting on her desk, neatly translated, thoroughly annotated, accompanied by a detailed legal analysis that read like an indictment of everything they had been about to approve. Beside it lay a 2-page executive summary that was clear, concise, and absolutely devastating in its implications for what could have happened if they had proceeded without understanding what they were signing. She stared at the papers for a long moment, her expression unreadable behind the carefully maintained mask of corporate composure that had served her through 2 decades of climbing the ladder in a male-dominated industry. The office was empty except for Marcus Chun, head of legal affairs, who had called her as soon as he discovered the envelope and realized the magnitude of what it contained. "You're telling me this came in through anonymous channels?" she asked, her voice carrying the controlled tone of someone who was working very hard not to let her emotions show. "No identification, no contact information, no way to trace who submitted it?" Marcus nodded, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of genuine concern. "Nothing, just this." He slid the executive summary closer to her across the polished surface of her desk. "But Emma, you need to understand what we're looking at here. This isn't just a translation. This is a complete forensic analysis of every problematic clause, every legal landmine, every potential liability hidden in language that was deliberately designed to be incomprehensible." Emma read silently, her expression growing more serious with each paragraph until she reached the section that had been highlighted in red, the clause that would have granted their Italian partners unrestricted access to classified propulsion technology worth hundreds of millions of dollars in research and development. She looked up sharply, her composure finally cracking enough to show genuine alarm. "You're telling me we were 48 hours away from signing a document that would have given away our most valuable intellectual property and opened us up to federal prosecution for unauthorized technology transfer?" Her voice carried the kind of barely controlled fury that comes when someone realizes they've been played for a fool. Marcus pressed his lips together in a thin line, nodding grimly. "That's exactly what I'm telling you. And the analysis we received isn't the work of some amateur with a translation app. This required deep expertise in 3 languages, advanced understanding of aerospace engineering, and sophisticated knowledge of international technology transfer law. Whoever did this knows more about European contract law than half our senior legal team." Emma tapped the papers with her fingernail, a nervous habit she had developed during her early years when stakes were lower and mistakes were more forgivable. "This level of analysis. This isn't machine translation or even standard consulting work. This is the kind of expertise that usually comes with advanced degrees and decades of experience. Who could possibly have this combination of skills and also have access to our internal document systems?" Marcus hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward slightly. "I've been wondering the same thing. Should we try to investigate, see if we can trace the source?" Emma cut him off with a sharp shake of her head, her business instincts overriding her curiosity. "No, not yet. Whoever did this saved us from a disaster that could have destroyed the company and landed several of us in federal prison. The last thing we want to do is seem ungrateful or threatening to someone who just provided us with the most valuable consulting work we've ever received." By 8:45 a.m., word had begun to spread through the corporate ecosystem with the speed that only truly shocking news can achieve. In the internal legal department's secure messaging system, someone typed, "Has everyone seen the translation that appeared overnight? This is beyond professional-grade work. Whoever submitted this just saved us from walking into a lawsuit that would have made headlines for all the wrong reasons." Another colleague replied within minutes, "I've been practicing law for 22 years, and I've never seen analysis this thorough. I ran it through 3 different verification systems, cross-checked the legal references, even had our external consultants review the aerospace terminology. 0 errors. Whoever did this understands the intersection of technology law and international commerce better than people who charge us $500 an hour for much simpler work." At 9:15 a.m., David was methodically cleaning the base of the floor-to-ceiling windows in the ground floor reception area, working with the steady rhythm of someone who had long ago perfected the art of being productive while remaining invisible. The morning sunlight streamed through the glass, creating patterns on the floor that would shift and change throughout the day as the earth turned and the shadows moved. A natural clock that marked time in ways that had nothing to do with corporate schedules or quarterly reports. The assistant building manager approached him with the casual friendliness that characterized most of their interactions, stopping just close enough to speak without raising his voice above the ambient noise of the building's climate control systems. "Hey David, you were working the night shift yesterday, right?" David straightened up, maintaining the expression of polite attention that he had perfected over years of brief, forgettable conversations with people who outranked him in the corporate hierarchy. "Yes, sir. Standard rounds. Nothing unusual. Why do you ask?" "Oh, it's probably nothing important." The manager replied with a shrug that suggested he was already losing interest in the conversation. "There was some kind of document left in the legal department's drop box, and they're trying to figure out if anyone saw who might have submitted it. Thought maybe you noticed someone working late or anything out of the ordinary during your rounds." David shook his head with just the right amount of helpful concern. "Nothing that caught my attention. Just the usual empty hallways, forgotten coffee cups, the occasional executive working late trying to impress someone. Same routine as always." The manager chuckled and nodded, already turning away to continue whatever task had brought him to the lobby in the first place. "Yeah, that's what I figured. Thanks anyway, David. Keep up the good work." David returned to his window cleaning, his heart maintaining its steady rhythm despite the proximity of discovery. He didn't want thanks or recognition or credit for what he had done. What he wanted was impact, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his expertise had been used to protect people and prevent harm, even if no one would ever know his name was connected to the solution. That evening, back in the warmth and safety of their small apartment, Sarah sat at the kitchen table working on a watercolor painting of a fox moving through an abstract forest of geometric shapes and flowing colors. David watched her work with the quiet pride of someone who had learned to find profound meaning in small moments, then turned his attention to the city lights visible through their window, each one representing lives and dreams and struggles that remained invisible to those who lived in glass towers above the streets. "You're doing that thing again," Sarah said without looking up from her painting, her brush moving with the confident strokes of someone who trusted her artistic instincts completely. "What thing?" David asked, though he already knew what she meant. After 15 years of just the two of them, she could read his moods with the accuracy of a meteorologist predicting weather patterns. That quiet but not regular quiet thing. The kind of quiet you get when you've done something brave, but you're not sure if anyone noticed. She finally looked up, studying his face with the intensity she usually reserved for her artwork. "It's the same look you had right before you helped me talk to Mrs. Henderson about switching out of advanced calculus when I was struggling. You didn't say much then either, but you held my hand during the meeting, and somehow that made me feel like I could handle anything." David felt his throat tighten with emotion that he wasn't entirely prepared for. "You think I've done something brave?" Sarah nodded decisively, setting down her brush and giving him her complete attention. "I know you have. And I know it probably had something to do with that contract thing you mentioned, because you've been different since yesterday. Not bad different, good different. Like you remembered something important about yourself that you'd forgotten for a while." Meanwhile, 42 floors above the street in her corner office with its panoramic view of the city skyline, Emma Richardson sat alone watching the sun disappear behind a horizon of steel and glass. She clicked through digital files on her computer screen, all labeled with variations of Italian partnership agreement and aerospace technology transfer. The deeper she read into the translated document, the clearer it became that they had been moments away from a catastrophe that would have made international headlines for all the wrong reasons. If they had signed that version of the contract without understanding its true implications, Meridian Aerospace would have forfeited far more than intellectual property rights. They would have opened themselves to regulatory violations that could have triggered federal investigations, lawsuits that could have lasted for decades, and public relations disasters that would have destroyed the trust they had spent generations building with clients and partners around the world. Someone had saved them quietly, completely, and anonymously, asking for nothing in return except the satisfaction of preventing harm. The more Emma thought about it, the more extraordinary it seemed. In her 20-year career, she had never encountered anyone who possessed the combination of technical expertise and moral courage required to take such a risk for the benefit of others, especially when those others had treated them with casual dismissal and outright mockery. She found herself thinking about the cleaning staff, the security guards, the maintenance workers, all the people who moved through the building's corridors like shadows, maintaining the infrastructure that allowed the visible work to happen. She realized with uncomfortable clarity that she had never bothered to learn most of their names, had never considered that any of them might possess knowledge or capabilities that extended beyond their job descriptions. The memory of her casual arrogance the day before, "Translate this and my salary is yours," now felt like evidence of a worldview that was not only wrong, but dangerously limited. How many other brilliant people had she overlooked because they didn't fit her narrow definition of expertise? How many opportunities for genuine collaboration had she missed because she assumed that intelligence and education were the exclusive property of people who dressed like her and talked like her? At 11:27 p.m., David was finishing his maintenance rounds on the 38th floor, working with the methodical efficiency that came from years of perfecting routines that allowed him to complete his tasks while his mind processed more complex problems. The hallways were empty except for the occasional security guard making rounds, the offices dark except for the computer monitors that never quite shut down, the corporate world reduced to its essential elements: space, silence, and the persistent hum of climate control systems maintaining perfect conditions for tomorrow's productivity. He paused by the same conference room where Emma had made her challenge, where laughter had echoed off glass walls while important people congratulated themselves on their superiority to problems they didn't understand. The champagne glasses were gone now, the contract disappeared, the moment of casual cruelty transformed into something approaching justice, though justice administered so quietly that the people who had benefited from it would never know exactly how or why they had been saved. David reached into his pocket and pulled out his leather journal, the one that had traveled with him through academic conferences and late-night research sessions, through the gradual dissolution of one life and the careful construction of another. He flipped to the last entry and added a single line. "Some truths are too important to remain silent, even when speaking them requires becoming visible again." He closed the notebook, turned off the conference room lights, and continued down the hall toward the service elevator that would take him home to Sarah and their small apartment and the life they had built together out of love and necessity and the daily choice to find meaning in whatever circumstances they faced. The boardroom felt different than it had just days before, charged with intention that had nothing to do with quarterly projections or market analysis, and everything to do with the realization that assumptions they had held for years were being systematically dismantled. The early morning sunlight cast sharp geometric shadows across the Italian marble table, dividing the room into zones of light and darkness that seemed symbolic of the larger divisions being revealed in their corporate culture. Emma Richardson stood at the head of the table, her usual commanding presence somehow subdued by the weight of what they had learned about their own vulnerabilities. Her fingers rested lightly on the leather portfolio that contained the translated document, the evidence of expertise they had never bothered to look for within their own organization. "I want to be absolutely clear about what we're discussing here," she began, her voice carrying the controlled intensity of someone who had spent the weekend reconsidering fundamental assumptions about leadership and competence. "If we had signed that agreement without proper analysis, we would have violated multiple federal statutes governing technology transfer, surrendered proprietary information worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and opened ourselves to criminal prosecution for violations of export control laws." The silence that followed was heavy with implications that extended far beyond the immediate crisis they had avoided. Gordon Walsh, the chief financial officer, cleared his throat nervously before speaking. "So the question becomes, how did our entire legal review process fail to catch problems that someone else identified immediately? And who exactly is this someone else?" Emma paused, recognizing that her answer would reveal as much about her own limitations as it would about their mysterious benefactor. "I don't have a name," she replied carefully. "The translation was submitted through our anonymous reporting system. But whoever they are They demonstrated a level of expertise in technical translation, international law, and aerospace engineering that exceeds what we typically expect from our external consultants. From across the table, Marcus Chin spoke with the measured caution of someone who had spent the weekend reviewing every aspect of their legal procedures. The analysis included references to Italian commercial law that I had to verify with our Rome office, German aerospace regulations that required consultation with our Munich partners, and American export control statutes that our own compliance department hadn't fully considered. This wasn't the work of someone with casual knowledge. This was someone with deep, professional-level expertise in multiple specialized fields. Emma found herself studying the faces around the table, seeing her colleagues with new clarity as she recognized how quickly they had all accepted that such expertise must have come from outside their organization. "What if," she said slowly, "the person we're looking for isn't outside the building at all? What if they've been here all along, and we just never bothered to see them?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything they thought they knew about talent, education, and the distribution of valuable knowledge within their own corporate structure. Downstairs in the lobby, David moved through his morning cleaning routine with the same steady attention to detail that characterized all his work, but his mind was processing the subtle changes in atmosphere that suggested significant developments were taking place in the executive offices above. He had learned to read the building's moods over the years, to sense when routine corporate business was giving way to crisis management or strategic planning that would affect the entire organization. He didn't need to look up to know when Emma Richardson entered the lobby, flanked by two senior executives whose body language suggested they were engaged in intense discussion about matters far more serious than typical business operations. He could feel the change in energy, the way conversations stopped and resumed, the way security personnel straightened their posture, and support staff became more attentive to their surroundings. "David." Her voice carried across the marble expanse of the lobby with surprising clarity, cutting through the ambient noise of a building coming to life with the day's activities. He turned slowly, maintaining the expression of respectful attention that had served him well through countless brief interactions with people whose names appeared on organizational charts far above his own position. "Yes, Ms. Richardson." She approached him with a directness that felt different from their previous encounters, her usual corporate efficiency tempered by something that might have been uncertainty, or perhaps a newfound awareness of complexities she had previously overlooked. "I was hoping I could speak with you privately for a few minutes." David nodded, setting his cleaning supplies aside with the careful attention of someone who had learned that interruptions to routine work could have lasting consequences if not handled properly. "Of course. Would you prefer that I secure my equipment first?" "Please." She waited while he moved his cart to a designated storage area, then gestured toward a small conference room near the executive elevator bank, a space typically reserved for confidential discussions that required immediate access to senior management. They walked together through corridors that David knew intimately from years of night maintenance, but had never experienced during daylight hours when they were filled with the energy and ambition of corporate decision-making. The conference room smelled faintly of expensive coffee and leather upholstery, materials that spoke of budgets and priorities far removed from the industrial cleaning supplies and fluorescent lighting that defined his usual work environment. Emma closed the door behind them and turned to face him directly, her expression serious but not unkind. "I need to ask you a direct question, and I hope you'll consider giving me an honest answer." David waited, his face calm and attentive despite the acceleration of his heartbeat that always accompanied moments when his carefully maintained invisibility was suddenly threatened by unwanted attention. "Did you submit the translation of the Italian aerospace contract?" The question hung between them like a bridge that could lead to revelation or catastrophe, depending on how he chose to cross it. David looked at her steadily, recognizing that this moment would determine not only his own future, but potentially the future of his relationship with Sarah, their home, their carefully constructed life built on the foundation of choices made years ago when the world had seemed to offer only painful alternatives. "I did," he said quietly, his voice carrying no trace of apology or defensiveness, just the simple acknowledgement of truth that could no longer be avoided or delayed. Emma's expression shifted subtly, relief and curiosity replacing the uncertainty that had dominated her features since entering the room. She leaned against the conference table, her posture becoming less formal as she processed the confirmation of what she had already begun to suspect. "Why anonymously?" she asked. "You could have requested anything: recognition, promotion, financial compensation. Why submit something so valuable without asking for credit?" David considered the question carefully, understanding that his answer would reveal not only his motivations, but his entire philosophy about work, recognition, and the relationship between expertise and power. "Because I didn't do it for credit or compensation. I did it to prevent harm. To your company, to your employees, to the people whose jobs depend on Meridian's success, and to my daughter, whose future is connected to the stability of the community we live in." Emma studied him with the intensity of someone encountering a perspective that challenged fundamental assumptions about human motivation and professional behavior. "You're not just a maintenance worker, are you?" "I am now," David replied with the quiet dignity of someone who had made peace with choices that others might view as incomprehensible surrenders. "But I wasn't always. And the skills I developed in my previous career occasionally prove useful in ways that my current job description doesn't officially recognize." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, ranging across topics that neither of them had expected to discuss when they woke up that morning. The nature of expertise, the invisibility of essential workers, the assumptions that prevent organizations from recognizing talent that doesn't conform to traditional expectations, and the personal circumstances that had led a former professor of applied linguistics to spend his nights maintaining the offices where other people's careers flourished. When they finally emerged from the conference room, both of them had been changed by the encounter. Emma had been forced to confront the limitations of her own perspective and the possibility that valuable knowledge might be found in places she had never thought to look. David had been reminded that expertise, once developed, never truly disappears. It simply waits for opportunities to serve purposes larger than personal advancement. That afternoon, as David changed out of his work uniform in the employee locker room, he found a sealed envelope waiting in his personal storage compartment. Inside was a letter written on company letterhead in Emma's precise handwriting, along with a check that represented more money than he typically earned in 6 months of night maintenance work. The letter was brief but carefully worded. "Your expertise prevented a catastrophe that would have affected thousands of people, including many who will never know how close we came to disaster. This compensation represents a small acknowledgement of the value you provided. But more importantly, I want you to know that your contribution has been seen and appreciated by people who understand its significance." David stared at the check for a long moment, then carefully folded it back into the envelope without endorsing it. He placed the envelope in his backpack alongside his thermos and paperback novel, then finished changing into his street clothes with the methodical attention that characterized all his daily routines. Walking home through streets that were beginning to show the early signs of evening, David thought about the conversation with Emma and the unexpected recognition of abilities he had assumed would remain permanently hidden. He thought about Sarah and the pride she had expressed in his willingness to use his knowledge to help others, even when that help went unacknowledged. He thought about Maria and the dreams they had shared about using their education and expertise to make positive differences in the world, dreams that had seemed to die with her, but that might, perhaps, be finding new forms of expression. When he arrived at their apartment, Sarah was waiting with homework spread across the kitchen table and a smile that suggested she had been anticipating his return with more than usual excitement. "How was work?" she asked, her tone carrying the subtle emphasis that indicated she suspected the answer might be more interesting than usual. "Complicated," David replied, hanging his jacket on the hook by the door and moving to wash his hands at the kitchen sink. "But good complicated, I think." Sarah nodded as if this confirmed something she had already concluded. "Good. Because I finished my college application essays, and I wrote about having a father who taught me that intelligence and integrity are more important than recognition or status. I hope that's okay with you." David turned from the sink to look at her, feeling the weight of pride and love and gratitude that came from realizing that the most important lessons he had tried to teach had somehow been successfully transmitted despite all the uncertainty and sacrifice that had characterized their life together. "It's more than okay," he said quietly. "It's perfect." Later that evening, after Sarah had gone to bed and the apartment had settled into its familiar nighttime quiet, David sat at the kitchen table with the unopened envelope beside him and his leather journal opened to a fresh page. He wrote slowly, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood that some thoughts deserve to be preserved exactly as they first emerged from the intersection of experience and reflection. Today I was reminded that expertise is not diminished by humility, that knowledge finds ways to serve the world regardless of the circumstances in which it is applied, and that the most meaningful recognition comes not from titles or salary increases, but from the understanding that what you know can be used to protect and serve others. Tomorrow I will return to my night rounds, but I will carry with me the knowledge that being seen and being valued are not the same thing, and that sometimes the greatest contribution you can make is the one that no one expects from someone in your position. He closed the journal and looked once more at the envelope, then made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He would not cash the check, but neither would he return it. Instead, he would keep it as a reminder that recognition, when it comes, should be measured not by its monetary value, but by its acknowledgement of the truth that every person carries within them the potential for contributions that extend far beyond the limitations of job descriptions or social expectations. The next morning brought news that would reshape everything David thought he knew about the consequences of his decision to break his long silence. Emma Richardson called an emergency meeting of the senior staff, and for the first time in Meridian Aerospace's corporate history, she invited a member of the maintenance crew to join the executive conference room discussion not as a witness or a source of information, but as a colleague whose expertise was essential to the conversation they needed to have. David sat at the polished conference table wearing his best civilian clothes, still simple and understated but clean and professional, surrounded by people whose salaries exceeded his annual income by factors that made mathematical comparison almost meaningless. But for the first time in over a decade, he felt like he belonged in a room where important decisions were being made, not because of his job title or his position in the corporate hierarchy, but because of what he knew and what he could contribute to solving problems that mattered. The conversation that followed would eventually lead to changes in Meridian's approach to professional development, employee recognition, and the identification of talent within their existing workforce. It would result in new policies designed to ensure that expertise was valued regardless of its source, and that assumptions about education and capability were regularly examined and challenged. But more immediately, it led to an offer that David had never expected and wasn't entirely sure he was prepared to accept: the opportunity to return to work that utilized his linguistic and analytical abilities, with compensation that would allow Sarah to attend college without financial stress and give both of them access to opportunities that had seemed permanently out of reach. "We're creating a new position," Emma explained, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had thought carefully about the proposal she was making. Director of International Compliance and Risk Assessment. It would involve reviewing all of our overseas contracts and partnerships, ensuring that we understand not just the legal language, but the cultural and regulatory implications of our international business relationships. David listened carefully, understanding that this offer represented not just professional opportunity, but a fundamental change in how he and Sarah would navigate the world, the resources available to them, and the legacy he would leave for her future. But he also understood that accepting it would mean abandoning the invisibility that had protected them both from the complications and expectations that came with professional recognition. "I need time to consider this carefully," he said finally. "This decision affects not just me, but my daughter, and I want to make sure that any choice I make serves her interests as well as my own." Emma nodded, her expression suggesting that she had expected this response and respected the thoughtfulness it represented. "Of course, take whatever time you need. The position will remain open until you've had a chance to discuss it with Sarah and determine what feels right for your family." That evening, David and Sarah sat together in their small living room, the job offer spread out on the coffee table between them like a map to a destination they had never imagined visiting. The terms were generous almost beyond comprehension: a salary that would allow them to move to a larger apartment, benefits that would cover Sarah's college expenses, and professional recognition that would restore David's academic credentials and open doors that had been closed for more than a decade. "What do you think?" David asked, genuinely uncertain about what choice would serve their long-term interests while remaining true to the values that had guided their life together. Sarah studied the documents carefully, her artistic sensibility balanced by the analytical thinking she had inherited from both parents. "I think," she said slowly, "that you've been hiding long enough. Not from the world, from yourself. This isn't about money or status or proving anything to people who didn't appreciate you before. This is about using what you know to help people, which is what you've always wanted to do." She looked up at him with the directness that had always been one of her most distinctive characteristics. "Besides, I'm going to college in 2 years anyway. It might be nice if you remembered how to be Dr. Weber again before I bring home friends who want to talk about their majors and career plans." David smiled, feeling something shift inside him that had been locked in place for so long he had forgotten it was capable of movement. "You think I should accept?" "I think," Sarah said, reaching across the table to take his hand, "that you should stop punishing yourself for choices you made out of love. Mom would want you to be happy, and I want you to be proud of what you do every day instead of hiding from it." The following Monday, David Weber walked into the Meridian Aerospace building wearing a suit that fit properly and carrying a briefcase that contained his credentials, his research portfolio, and a business card that read, "Dr. David Weber, Director of International Compliance and Risk Assessment." He was no longer invisible, no longer hiding behind the protective anonymity of maintenance work, no longer apologizing for expertise that had taken decades to develop and moments to prove. But he was still the same man who had chosen love over ambition 13 years earlier, still the father who understood that the most important job he would ever have was raising Sarah to be confident, compassionate, and capable of making her own choices about how to use whatever talents she discovered within herself. And as he settled into his new office with its view of the city skyline and its proximity to conversations that would shape the future of international aerospace commerce, David realized that he had learned something valuable during his years of deliberate invisibility. That expertise without humility is merely performance, that knowledge without service is just intellectual vanity, and that the most meaningful recognition comes not from titles or salaries, but from the understanding that what you know can be used to protect and serve others who might never know your name, but whose lives are made better by your willingness to speak truth when silence would be easier. The story of the night janitor who saved a corporation had become something larger. The story of a man who discovered that redemption doesn't always look like returning to where you started, but sometimes like carrying forward the wisdom gained from choosing a different path and finding the courage to use that wisdom when the world needs it most.